Yes.
They don't allow shopping. They don't have a casino. They don't have a show.
What did you sell? Yes, I did. I just did you get any? The market sounding very good.
And food and lots of stuff.
We're out of town.
Nice. Ought to be a lot of fun.
Should be. No children.
Best of all. Well, if I don't talk to you,
So it looks like January.
Next Saturday.
I won't be here either next Saturday. So we don't leave. We're off for a couple of weeks. Yeah, January. Next time I see you, you'll be back.
Good.
So,
This is my daughter from Solon, who just
Hi.
got back from Israel.
Nice to see you.
Position, you know that.
Hello.
And Rabbi Klein.
Nice to see you.
Who's your husband?
Ryan Novak.
I know another Novak, Brian.
Yes, they're cousins.
They're cousins.
yeah.
Well, thank you. So good to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay.
So she came to the Torah Study from her Israel trip.
Nice.
Yes.
Okay.
Can't wait to report back to my group.
Good for
Nice to
you.
see you. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Shabbat shalom to everybody. So good to see you and to be together. Let me offer a couple of thank yous for bagels and streaming. Malcolm and Vivian Hennock, thank you so much. And for Pickup Patty, I saw Patty, thank you so much. Very good. Our plans are working well, so it really means a lot to me and to all of us that we've got this pattern and we show up here and bagels are here. What could be better than that? Okay. So, welcome to those who are live streaming. Sometimes I forget to welcome you, but so glad to have you as well. Let's begin with our blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so today in the Torah portion by Yishlach, beginning in chapter 32, we have a kind of reconciliation between Jacob and Esau. And as I was thinking about this, I thought it would be useful for us to think about the whole issue of sibling relationships in the book of Genesis especially. My first idea about describing this briefly is, let's think about sibling rivalry. And there is a lot of sibling rivalry. But I think that as I was going through some of the episodes, that we need a broader name for this. And I've come upon sibling relationships. Because sibling rivalry suggests that the tensions between siblings has its origin in the siblings themselves. But I think as we'll see, though that is true for some of these episodes, it often has to do with the parents who sow the seeds of the rivalry. And often the rivalry itself does not burst into action, but the tensions exist. Let's say between Isaac and Ishmael. I don't think they ever clash themselves, but the parents create some of the tensions. So I guess the subject is, and I'm just not sure what finally to name it. I must confess I'm a little puzzled by the phenomena and how to understand it in broader terms. that there is something about the family which has its impact on the children that create these tensions. We see it beyond the book of Genesis for sure. I mean, we have it between Moses and Aaron. We have it certainly between David and his siblings. So the authors of the Tanakh seem to be up to some worry about relationships within a family. Let me just point out something that Maimonides says in the third part of the Guide for the Perplexed, that the family is the first part of the city. The family, in a way, is a microcosm of the relationship among, let's call them citizens, members of a particular polity or group. And if the family is a microcosm, then in some way, understanding the family, its possibilities and its tensions, is a way of understanding the community, its possibilities and tensions. Because after all, I mean, if we just think about this in more naturalistic terms, by this I mean, let's keep God out of it for a while and not wonder what God's plans are. The well-being, the weal or woe of a community has to do, obviously, with the relationships among members of the community. And whether or not the community flourishes or even survives has something to do with these relationships. I'm bracketing God out of it just because God may have a plan, and whatever human beings do, God's plan is going to find its fruition. And I don't want to think about that idea at this point, not that it's not a powerful idea in biblical literature. But what is it that can create harmony, strength, durability in a community? And if that seems too broad a topic to deal with, let's deal with its microcosmic parallel, the family. And one of the great themes of biblical literature is precisely family relationships. So I want to suggest not only do we learn a great deal about family when we look at these relationships, for better or for worse, but we're also anticipating questions about community. So let me just give you one example by looking beyond Genesis, or looking at Genesis at the end and what follows. So one of the great themes of the story of Joseph and his brothers, which takes up a full quarter of the book of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50, it's certainly about a lot of things, but one of the things it's about is the relationship among the brothers. That relationship begins the epic of Joseph and his brothers, and it continues to the very end when Joseph and the brothers are reconciled. Why does the book of Genesis end with the story of Joseph and his brothers? There are two answers to this question at least. One so obvious as not to even require being mentioned, and the other, I think, a little deeper. The one that doesn't require being mentioned, although you're going to see I'm going to mention it, is that this is the next step in the unfolding of the family dynamic down through the generations. I mean, there's Jacob. Jacob gets married. He has wives. The wives have children. The children have problems. What's the big deal here? We're just tracing the epic of the family. If we think of it, though, in terms of problems and solutions, we might ask ourselves, what is the big problem at the beginning of the next book, the book of Exodus? And that is the community in a hazardous situation of the pressures from Egyptian society, slavery, and so on. How can this family accomplish what they accomplished through natural growth? So, in Joseph's day, there was a Pharaoh who was positively disposed to the Israelites. The book of Exodus opens, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And we might think that, and the Torah gives us reason to believe it, that hundreds of years have passed between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. 430 years. So the number of years differs, but certainly a long period of time. And lo and behold, the family is still intact at this point. They've grown to be a people, but they're intact. How have they maintained their health and their durability? We don't know. The rabbis speculate. They gave their children Hebrew names. They maintained some of the sense of their history and therefore their destiny. We don't know. But one thing we do know is that they remain intact, ready to leave as an entity, as a community. How did this happen? I don't know. What is one interesting speculation? Because at the end of Genesis, the family, namely the sons of Jacob, were able to come back together again and recreate a harmonious relationship. And therefore the book of Genesis ends with the family in harmony, which lays the foundation for the possibility of a harmonious future, which we can infer takes place. Because a half a millennium later, they're still intact as a community. So I want to suggest, and this of course is speculation, that one of the questions of the book of Genesis is, how is it that natural enmity, rivalry, tension within a family can be healed so that the family can remain intact, and by extension, if the family is a microcosm of the community can remain intact. So it strikes me that one of the main themes of the book of Genesis, tensions within a family, are not only exploring this dynamic in which we are all involved, who isn't involved in this, but also it has a larger purpose. Because unless the family can find a way to get along with one another, in spite of the natural tensions which always arise, the family and by extension the community is always imperiled. And one of the things that the Tanakh is interested in is, how does this enterprise continue and flourish given all the impediments from within and from without? Nature in a certain way puts pressure on families and on communities, enemies, other peoples, the whole issue of scarcity. There's not enough land and resources for everybody to have what they want, and so there's always a struggle over resources. How is it that communities can become and be durable over and against the impediments from within the family and from without? So that's what I want us to look at today. The episodes in the Tanakh that deal with the relationship among siblings, which I think will help us to understand some of the larger themes that the Bible is interested in. Somebody. Stuart?
Two things. First of all, the Tanakh only refers to Levi, I think.
Uh-huh.
In the whole Exodus story, it's only Levi that Moses is part of, Aaron, of course, Miriam, but the rest of the family, or rest of the tribe, is ignored. But also, the Egyptians are largely to blame or to account for that,
Account for what?
for the cohesiveness of the Jewish people.
If you have a common enemy, you can be cohesive. Is that your
If you
point?
have a common enemy, or if you're treated as a group. We've seen that in America with the blacks and Latinos. But if let's say the people, the Egyptians, the Pharaoh, managed to treat them all as foreigners,
Uh-huh.
which I think was a part of their cohesiveness as a people.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I recall many decades ago, it seems to me that John Kenneth Galbraith, who was an economist at Harvard, proposed the following idea. Let's try to, through rhetorical means, create in the American public a sense that there is an enemy out there on another planet, and that this enemy is always threatening us. And his idea was, if we can make plausible and powerful the existence of a common enemy, not an enemy from within, not an enemy on this planet, but outside, that, I think this is one of Stuart's points, that will create the kind of cohesiveness over and against a common enemy that is hard to create or to maintain if our enemies are always within. That's part of your point, isn't it? And I think it's a good point. I mean, I wouldn't want to claim that the only way in which a community can become cohesive and durable is to heal itself. There are common enemies. I mean, there is drought, there is plague, and so on, which is an enemy from without, so to speak, not the creation of ourselves that can create, at its best, coherence. So I think that's a very good point, and that's an addition to our understanding. On the other hand, rivalries continue throughout the book of Exodus. When Moses comes back to the people to tell them the plan, the people rebel against Moses. Who made you, and so on, king over us? Also early on with these fights, Aaron and Moses continue to fight throughout. The very notion of law, which begins with the Sinai revelation, suggests a need for some instrument to bring harmony within a people. We wouldn't need law if our natural inclinations were pacific. And therefore the very existence in law and the need for not only law but the vast proliferation of law suggests that a society and its members need constantly to recognize the consequences of problematic activity. Okay, so Jim, and then I want to get to some of our episodes here.
I think we have a really good example right now in
Yes.
this country of what Stuart was saying, because we as a people tried to forcibly, brutally assimilate the Native Americans, but they're still separate.
Uh-huh.
They maintained their identity despite rather brutal efforts to assimilate them.
Okay, that's an interesting point, yeah. I think that may overlook some of the complexities of the history and the rivalries within about how to deal with, but no, I think it's a good point. Okay, so let's turn here to Genesis chapter 4 and look at the first example. And I want to ask, what are the causes of these problems? So this is the Cain and Abel story. One of the first, if not the first, episode following the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Paradise is gone. Human beings are now on their own. And the first episode reflects rivalry. And rivalry that ends in murder. And a murder that is not only one person against another, but one brother against another. Or as we might suggest, the first family episode that takes place out of the Garden of Eden, that is in historical time, is fratricide. And that's a pretty devastating reality, isn't it? That the Torah, in its wisdom, is suggesting that at the very foundation of civilization is a murder. Okay? You remember Freud's notion in Totem and Taboo that the Israelites rise up against Moses and kill him and then lift him up into a kind of totem to be venerated. So Freud's original sin, too, we might say, is also a murder. Chapter 4. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and she bore Cain, saying, I've gained a male child with the help of the Lord. And when we looked at this some weeks ago, I pointed out that with the help of the Lord is an interpretation. I have gained or purchased a child with the Lord, which can be understood as I am equal in my procreative power to God. I rise to the level of divinity, maybe this is a bit overstated, in my capacity to create. And therefore, the one who opens the womb has a kind of primacy of place. The firstborn child. The mother's sense of exultation in having created. And the second-born, the third-born, do not have that, let's call it, ontological status. By that I mean, in reality, a parent may find more to favor in a second or third-born child. But in terms of priority, it's the firstborn who does what subsequent borns don't do. Open the womb and reveal the creative power of the woman. Okay? So if that has some plausibility to it, the topic sibling rivalry is insufficient to describe the phenomenon. Because the phenomenon of rivalry goes back to parental favoritism. I'm not saying that favoritism of the one who opens the womb is inevitable or predominant. I mean, obviously parents can deal with these situations in their own way. But there is something in the nature of things that creates a sense of priority and secondariness. I have gained a male child with the Lord. That's how I'm translating it. She bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of the flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. So here's a second factor, isn't that? And that is in the issue of motivation. What is it that motivates Abel, the choicest firstlings of the flock? One can take this too far. And as I always say, you never know when you've gone too far until you go too far. That Abel recognizes that what he has is a gift. And therefore, he has to give some of it back. He has to acknowledge the gift in some significant way. And since what he has is choice, he has to give what is choice back. I don't like that. If he's going to, I don't like that as the idea here. Once I heard myself say it. What it is that Abel feels gratitude, I'm inferring. And if you're going to feel gratitude, give, and you're going to make some sort of a gift, give a real gift. If you're going to give an end-of-the-year gift to your university or college, and you loved your experience there, and you feel grateful for what that institution gave you, and they're asking for money, and here's how they ask. You can check the following boxes: $100, $150, $200, $500, $1,000, $10,000, other. I'm going to give them $5. That's possible. They gave me that option. I'm going to give them 10, 15. How much gratitude am I feeling if I have the wherewithal to give more, to express my gratitude with a substantial gift? How much did you give to your college? I'm not going to tell you. Oh, please. $5. Really? What kind of gratitude is that? Did you have a terrible experience there? Abel understands the gift, and therefore has thinking about what he ought to do in return. We don't know, but by contrast, we don't know about Cain, but the Torah suggests that his offering is perfunctory. And therefore, God wants the intentionality here. So, the rivalry and the murder of Abel by Cain has to do with, I want to suggest, both a parental move and a move on the part of the boys themselves. And God responds to the gift, the two gifts. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you distressed? Why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift, but if you don't, sin crouches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master." Cain said to his brother Abel, in other words, temptation exists right from the very, very beginning, crouches at the door, we might say, of the transition from the womb to the world. And the Lord, verse 9, said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" This is a rhetorical question framed in a positive terms. Am I? For which, in a rhetorical question, the answer is no. In other words, Cain is saying, I'm not my brother's keeper. Although the Torah is suggesting, yes, you are. So that this thematizes the question of the relationship among siblings. Are we our siblings' keeper or not? Why would one have to raise that question at all if it were obvious what the answer is? It's raised because the answer is not obvious. Tensions emerge among siblings, And one natural implication or outcome might be, I'm not my brother's keeper. And therefore, the Torah right away, I think, is pointing to, in a very terse thematic way, that there are, since this is the very first act in history, which is sobering enough, isn't it? Whether or not siblings have the wherewithal to get along. Because there are two causes of the rivalry. I might say three. One is nature itself, the one who opens the womb versus the one who doesn't open the womb. The firstborn versus the second, third, whatever born. Nature also creates these tensions, as does both parental favoritism and sibling rivalry. Because it's not natural that I'm my brother's keeper. Right? Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are. I don't think so. Why are you raising the question at all, if it's so clear? So, there is, I think, already the causes, the three causes of these problems. I mean, in a certain way, this is a quite surgical exploration of this phenomenon in a very few verses. Nature, parents, and siblings are the causes. Maya?
I want to play the devil's advocate.
Do.
So what it says is, Cain is the first one that wants to give God a present or a sacrifice. Abel is followed.
Yes.
So the initiative comes from Cain. And I think that in this case, I think that God is the one that is the problematic one, because why should he not accept Cain's sacrifice, which was at least offered by him with the best of intentions? So why does he prefer Abel's sacrifice? So I think that you said nature and parents, God is a partner in this play as well.
It's an interesting point, actually. Right. Why is David, I mean, when Samuel goes to find a successor to King Saul, and he goes down to Jesse's family and says, bring all the boys out. It brings all the boys out. And Samuel says, no. Do you have any more? These don't seem to be the right ones. Any more? Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have a little guy. He's tending the flocks. I didn't bring him because obviously this guy's not the candidate. And lo and behold, it's David. David comes and Samuel says, this is the one. Why is David the one? Natural endowment. He's able to stand up against Goliath. I mean, he has enormous charisma. In other words, God has gifted him in a way that God has not gifted the others. So I think this is another illustration of your point, that God in a certain way makes choices too by endowing us unequally. So I think that's a good point. The other way of looking at it, though, and I don't want to prefer one over the other, is that God's choice may be a way of indicating the importance of motivation.
Or you can put it differently. Eve had a hubris because she said, hey, I gave birth. So God says, okay, I'll show you. So I'm going to prefer not to your firstborn, but the secondborn.
You prefer Cain, and I'm going to balance it by preferring Abel. Maybe. Although the plain meaning of the text is that Abel's motivation is expressed, Cain's is not. So why is it that the author brings in motivation? As if that matters. And because God favors Abel may be a theological way of saying something psychological. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Stuart?
I agree with the previous speaker, whose name I forgot.
Maya.
Maya. Thank you.
We all forget names. I'm glad you pointed that out. You know, I say to people all the time when I meet them, I say to them, it's going to take me 4 times to remember your name. So I'm going to be asking you again and again and again. It's always embarrassing, especially if you just met the person the other day, but good. That's a big aside.
I agree with her, with Maya. And I think that the fault lies with God. Same thing with him opening Sarah's womb later, after her helpmaiden has delivered Ishmael. It's clear that God has played favorites.
Yeah. So, what are we going to do about this? So let me suggest something that we've seen over and over again in the story of Joseph and his brothers. You remember at the end when the brothers are terrified that Joseph is finally going to have his way with them and wreak vengeance on them, that Joseph says, God meant this whole episode for good, so that I get down here to Egypt, rise to power, can bring you down, can save the family from famine, and therefore guarantee a future. God meant this for good, though you meant it for evil. So what the Torah is summarizing here is what we've called dual causality. There is a divine causality implicit in biblical literature. God is an actor, and God acts, and oftentimes in ways to favor one person, one situation over another. And one cannot bracket that out from biblical literature. But the other factor is human. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. How did the brothers get down to Egypt? Well, we can trace it through human motivation, action, and the consequences of human action. Right? The brothers put him in the pit. He's sold to traders. They take him down. Why do they take him down? They're traders. He gets in trouble. He rises to power in Potiphar's house because he is so well endowed with attributes. He has to escape Potiphar's wife. He's in prison. The baker and the butler have these dreams they don't understand. They go to the guy who has the capacity to interpret the dreams and to interpret their dreams in ways that make sense to them and have consequences. So the whole story, I wonder if you agree with this. Here's my claim. There is a dual causality in these stories, each of which, and now I want to bracket out God for a minute, for which the coherence and development of the story can be understood in human terms alone. The Torah insists that that's not adequate, but it's certainly, if we want to just do a thought experiment and bracket God out of the equation, can be understood in human terms. The Torah's up to something more. It's up to the arc of history, the career of the historical process, and this requires God. But human beings on there, in other words, the Torah, it would be wrong to say the Torah is a humanist document, period. But if we want to eliminate the word period and make the claim that the Torah is a humanist document, we could get away with this. Couldn't we? Could we? So yes, God is playing a role. It's certainly true, and the Torah can't avoid it. But I want to hypothesize. I mean, I'm not sure. Finally, after all the arguments are deployed, whether or not I would stick to this in this kind of rigid terminology, that the Cain and Abel story can be understood in human terms. The mother is prideful at the one who opens the womb. Is that so strange? Abel has a pure motivation. His sacrifice is accepted, and it leads to trouble. And to the question, am I my brother's keeper? Which is a question we all have. I have a feeling, Candy, you have.
As a mother, I object to that.
Okay.
The idea of the mother is prideful of one who opens the womb.
Yeah.
I mean, when you have an egg for breakfast, you don't look at them and say, which one's going to taste better than the other, or which one came out first from the hen. And this whole idea of primogeniture is definitely human. It's definitely from us. It's not from God.
Well, that's the point that I'm making, though. She says, I have gotten a child along with God. And that child, the first child, in cultures, has supremacy.
No. She was lucky and got two. But I don't think that the fact that one came out first has any meaning at all.
Okay.
The children certainly don't know that, don't remember that. As a twin, I can tell you I didn't remember coming out first before my sister. And that's something that the parents put on the situation.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, so, powerfully put. I disagree with it, but, yeah, good. I mean, see, our problem is we're working here with a story that I think is a paradigm. These stories are an attempt to explain and help us understand the human condition. By definition, stories that seek to be paradigmatic may overreach, because not every example fits the paradigm. And what Candy is raising is the question of, I see the story, do I feel this in my own experience? And the answer always can be no. Can always be no. So,
I think it's
good,
fantasy.
good. You're pointing to the limitations of the story. Yeah. Did you have a question, comment?
Me?
Oh, I thought you did. Malcolm?
I think these books are about the relationship of man and mankind to God. So I understand your earlier point in the comment about this being looked at just on a human-to-human basis, but fundamentally, I don't think these books were written with that purpose. And I think it strikes me that God spends a lot of time with very direct conversation with these individuals early in Genesis. So these are immature relationships between man and God. Later we see more sophisticated or more mature relationships. But this is, to me, is fundamentally what is God's relationship to man? What is man's relationship to God? That's what That's what I think this story is about.
Yeah. Right. I would make a distinction, frankly, between the need for God, which we may not recognize, and the involvement of God and us in this relationship. My own sense is that these, and I've said this many times, that these early stories are pointing out the need for God, for revelation, for law, for something given to us. But what makes them especially powerful is that the individuals don't yet recognize this or integrate the involvement of God, God's words, law, standards, objectivity into their lives. My own view is that these first 11 chapters are pointing out, first of all, the need for something new. Abraham is something new. But Abraham is also not adequate because Abraham is a distinctive individual. And I think, now I'm just mimicking Maimonides' view of this, the history of this, that Abraham, in a certain way, arrives at something of the truth on his own. But we can't count on individuals to do this. We need community norms. So we have three stages, essentially. We have the stage before the recognition of the need for God. We have Abraham, who as an individual recognizes this need. And then we have Mount Sinai that suggests that if we as individuals don't recognize it, don't pay heed to it, still there's a community norm. I'm not going to stop when the light is red. I've just decided I'm not going to do it. Well, this is going to lead to some trouble. So whatever I want, if I'm wise, I stop. If I'm not, maybe I don't. And if I don't, it creates chaos. So that one of the things about law is it circumvents the fickleness of human nature to decide at one moment I'm not going to do what's good for the community, and so on. So I think you're right, Malcolm, that the authors of the Bible are insistent on the need for God. But whether or not human beings in our variousness do recognize that need is one of the challenges. Okay. Yes, Kathy?
So isn't it a cautionary tale? Because we have a fickle God, we have an angry God, we have a vengeful God. I mean, God has every attribute that supposedly, being different from humanity, he's the biggest player of them all in this with much more power. We're not seeing a different sort of entity, a different sort of character that would lead us to higher thinking, a better way. I mean, he's pretty rough on people along the way. So our giving over to an amorphous authority that's ruthless like this might be a cautionary tale.
Yes. So you've opened up a big question. Let me try to close it down and just make two comments about it. If you look at the career of God in the Bible, you see that, let me put it this way, God's interventions are front-loaded in the biblical narrative. In the book of Exodus is filled with divine interventions. As you move throughout the Bible, God recedes until the book of Daniel, the last book written. God is worshipped but doesn't act. God is understood as the Ancient of Days. It's not that God disappears because people worship God. But the story becomes much more thoroughgoingly humanistic. So I think that in a way illustrates an implication of your point, that if God's interference in some way is a problem, the Tanakh in the theological arc of the whole recognizes that human beings basically have to manage things on their own. Worshipping God, following God's commandments, that's to be sure, but not dependent on a God who, just to use your language, with which I somewhat disagree, is fickle. So I think there is something about what you're saying. Yeah. God is God. And we're not. Creator of the universe, worker of miracles. God is not dependent on human beings or in the human assessment of what God ought to do. And I think one of the ways of saying this is that in the ancient world, God or the gods' chief attribute is power. Take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground. Holy ground is dangerous. I'm likely to strike out at you if you do it incorrectly. You remember the story of Nadav and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10. They brought a strange fire before the Lord, and they were burnt to a crisp summarily. Be careful. Holiness is a resource, but it's also dangerous. Don't tamper with it. That's your idea a little bit. But God is also, of course, generous, compassionate, caring about human well-being. Why does God give us the Sinai covenant? Why does God keep coming back to the people after they go astray? Because God understands human nature. God is Abraham Joshua Heschel says that God is patient. He is waiting for a righteous generation. How long should God wait? Time is a fleeing. But God is infinite. He could wait a long time. In other words, God is hopeful that human beings will rise to our destiny. You know, there is this notion of teleology, which is a doctrine of purposes. We kind of have lost this notion that we have a destiny as human beings. Aristotle says, for example, that men and women are rational beings, and therefore what we ought to be doing to realize our full potential is to bring to realization what we essentially are. If we're fundamentally rational beings, then what we ought to do to be the best version of ourselves is to cultivate our reason. I think the Bible is also teleological in this sense. The best life to live is to live a life in the presence of God and what God has to offer us. Now, Freud would say the whole issue of belief in God is a zero-sum game, something like this. The more we venerate God, the less exalted we become. We have to give up our powers to God in order to be able to have a rich and fulfilled life. I think the Jewish view is that the more we venerate God, the higher we become as human beings. We realize our potential insofar as we cultivate and live in this relationship with God, who has given us the wherewithal to rise to our destiny. Homo religiosus is what Soloveitchik says. We are religious beings. And I think the Torah gives us good evidence for an argument in that favor, in that way. The more we obey the divine command and recognize God's role in the universe, the better versions of ourselves we become. So I think there is a kind of fickleness, unpredictability, a power element in God. But also I think the Torah wants to say that God's presence and impact is fundamentally benign in our lives. God calls Abraham to move the story forward and not to remain in the morass of the early stories of the Bible. Here's my outline for today. This is what, and I thought to myself when I got down here, I don't have enough. Here's where we are so far. Oh boy, have we gotten full to the completion of number 1? Okay, very good. Seeing no further hands, Jim, and then Michael.
What about we were talking about firstborn and family getting together, but how can we ignore the fact that particularly with Joseph and his brothers, there were 4 different mothers, and I understand we're in a totally patriotic society, but I can't believe that the person's own mother didn't favor them over the others. That's impossible.
No.
So therefore, the sons of any given mother have a whole different frame of reference. And yeah, it's their brother, they grew up with them and everything, but it's certainly not the same as me and my brother or you and yours.
Yeah.
The dynamics there don't work in our thinking.
Yeah.
I don't see how they can.
Well, I think it's an interesting point. A factor that makes it much more complicated, not just many children, but many parents.
Yeah.
And if parents prefer, I know Candy's going to resist this, but prefer in terms of at least birth order, if not in other things, one child over another, this just, the magnitude is fourfold. What's interesting about this, though, is that the favored wife among the 4 is Rachel.
Right.
And Rachel has the last 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin. Leah has 6 of these children, 2 of whom are Levi and Judah. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. So that the wife who is not favored has the 2 sons who make the most impact. I mean, who makes more impact than the priestly tribe and the monarchical tribe? I mean, from Judah comes David. From Levi comes Aaron. So that there it seems to be somewhat paradoxical. But it doesn't deny your point here that it makes it much more complicated.
Dare I?
Is that a hand or not?
Well, I was about to say dare I, but I wanted to go back to your first sentence this morning. The
Yes.
family is
Yeah.
a city. And the family
Yeah.
is a city.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's interesting that the 4 doesn't end in fratricide, but ends with Cain banished from the land to become a city. And then we get into all the names. And so the family has become, it has started right here to become the community city. And so the multiple wives all fit into there.
Yes.
And the family becomes more complicated. But I think it's interesting that Cain is the first step to city.
Founder of a city. So what are you saying? That this move from family to city, which I've pinpointed at the end of Genesis, from family to community, happens already at the very beginning.
Foreshadow. It
Well,
doesn't happen, but
well,
it
okay.
is here,
But-
right there, as a sign.
Yeah.
It's the
No, I think it's a
crossroads right
good
there.
point. I think it's a good point. Foreshadowing. Yeah. Cain is to his city as Joseph's descendants are to the people, something
Yes.
like that. By the way, it's not without interest, I guess is the way of saying it, that Cain, the one who murdered Abel, is the father of the city. There is, I think, an indirect polemic here against the city
Yeah.
as the place where, I mean, just think of the modern city with skyscrapers and everything paved over. It looks like our destiny is in our hands entirely. The city is the creation of human beings, and the modern city is the creation of human beings from beginning to end. What else is there but the modern city? In other words, the city can block out transcendence because we have made something so magnificent. Whereas if you're a nomad, if you're a shepherd or a farmer, you recognize all the time how dependent you are on actions out of your control. Drought, rain, the nature of the soil. So that there is a kind of agrarian preference here in the Bible against the domesticity of the city. And it's already foreshadowed, I think, in Cain, although it's easy to overstate that, which I'm close to doing. Michael?
Since we're characterizing God, to sort of disagree with you, I would say that the Cain and Abel story would appear that God is not a vegetarian, right? He wants the sheep, he doesn't want the grain. And if you think about sibling rivalry, my view would be that it's often rooted in food insecurity and conflict over food. So looking back to the beginning of Genesis, there seems to be quite a lot of conflict over food. You can or you can't have the apple. The apples are not for you to eat. You know, the choice between grain and sheep. Now, to go back to the growth of cities issue, you obviously cannot grow cities without agriculture.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about the murder of Cain is the question arises is who's going to be the shepherd now? I mean, you know, so, but if you look back also, God said that, you know, that Eve would suffer the pang of childbirth. And Adam would suffer the pang and the pain of being, you know, tilling the earth.
Yeah.
So God does seem to sort of favor not tilling the earth. But, you know, being a shepherd and, you know, just eating of the flesh. So, I mean, this question of food conflict, though, and all the suffering that comes from the lack of food, the lack of water, is fundamental to the Bible. But as you know, that's one of my biases, is to talk about human needs and look at always at you know, are they being better, are they not? And what is the human suffering that ensues
From?
when basic needs are not met?
Oh. So you're saying that among the items of scarcity, the Bible is also pointing to food scarcity, which creates rivalry. Yeah, that's an interesting point. God's world, if you look at Genesis 1, God's world is only full. But when you get to the second chapter, the story of the Garden of Eden, we begin to see that the world is also empty. Is that part of your point?
Well, it's always a struggle
Yeah.
to survive.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Okay. So, what are we going to do here? How about if we go to... So what are the other stories which we won't dwell on here? There's the story of Noah's sons when they came down off the ark. Shem, Ham, and Japhet. And Ham, the father of Canaan, sees his father naked and therefore is cursed. What's interesting is it's not Ham who's cursed, but Canaan, the son of Ham. And the Canaanites, I mean, this is a kind of a foreshadowing of this. Whereas Shem and Japhet are deferential to their father, Noah becomes the first vintner, the first person who cultivates the vine. And why should he know that that wine makes you drunk? So in a way, we can't blame Noah for it, but he's lying there naked, and one of his sons sees his nakedness, or maybe by implication engages in a homosexual act. It's not clear. Maybe the Bible is being euphemistic here. But Shem and Japhet, you remember, take the cloak and back and cover their father. So, that is not a case of sibling rivalry, but it's certainly a case of sibling difference. And it leads to consequences. Shem becomes the Semites, leads to Abraham, whereas Ham leads to the Canaanites. So in a way, this is a story of foreshadowing of the destiny of the peoples that come from that. From sibling difference comes rivalries among peoples. There's also Isaac and Ishmael, and this is not a rivalry between the two. I don't think they ever interact. But Sarah and Hagar are in some rivalrous situation. I mean, Hagar is innocent, but Sarah says, get rid of her. And finally, she doesn't like that the boys are playing together to get rid of Ishmael. So it's the mother here who is involved in favoritism. And it's the whole thing of genealogy. From a particular stem come branches and more branches. And if a group wants to maintain its integrity as something distinctive, it has to, at every juncture where there's branching, has to decide which way it's going to go. And Sarah's the one who makes that decision, even though out of cruelty to Hagar and to Ishmael. Okay? Okay. I keep thinking maybe you have a question that is emerging. There's also the rivalry between Rachel and Leah, because when Jacob goes north, he immediately falls in love with Rachel, and Laban will not allow Jacob to marry the younger child. We don't do it this way. Just a little anecdote out of my own family. So my mother was the youngest of 4 children. Her sister was the firstborn, then there were 2 sons, and it was my mother. My mother and my father wanted to get married, but her parents wouldn't allow her to get married until her oldest sister got married. Okay? So there was that idea that we don't do, this is not the way it's done. We have to, in some way, give some deference to the firstborn. I don't want to make too much about the firstborn issue here, but it's not the way it's done. And Rachel and Leah themselves are not involved in a problematic relationship, but their father, Laban, certainly wants to be sure. And Jacob suffers on account of it, right? You remember he wants to marry Rachel, but Leah's put in his tent. He wakes up the next morning. This is the surprise of all surprises in biblical literature. It's Leah. And he has to work another 7 years for Rachel, the youngest. So that's a younger, older story as well. But let's move now to Genesis chapter 32, 25. And let's look at the beginning of the Jacob and Esau story. So this is a sibling rivalry story that has a great deal of complexity to it. 25. Verse 19. The beginning of a new Torah portion, told goat. See it? This is the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took to wife Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, and so on. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. So this is one of God's chief roles early in the biblical story, of opening the womb, barrenness being a problem. She was barren, and the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children struggled in her womb, and she said, "If so, why do I exist?" She went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said, "Two nations are in your womb. Two separate peoples shall issue from your body." Notice it moves right away from the issue of individuals to community. "One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first one emerged red like a hairy mantle all over, so they named him Esau. Then his brother emerged holding onto the heel of Esau, so they named him Yaakov, Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. Sibling rivalry already in the womb. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. That is very tantalizing. We know why Esau favored Isaac. Isaac favored Esau because evidently he shared the hunter's ethos, something like that. We don't know why Rebekah favored Jacob. The Torah is silent here. But we could infer it maybe. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the open, famished, and Esau said to Jacob, "Give me some of that red stuff to gulp down, for I'm famished," which is why he was named Edom, from red. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "I'm at the point of death, so what is the use of my birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank and rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. Well, my goodness. What are we to make of this? What comes to mind here? Namely?
Appetite first, and disregard for the value of family.
Okay, so Esau favors the material elements of the world. Let's just put a little more appetite for food, a full belly, rather than the value of the birthright. Okay, so you want to say family. His obligations to his family as let's say, the leader of the family, certainly in the next generation. Okay? So, the outcome is felicitous because Esau would be a very problematic custodian of the birthright because he doesn't favor something large, he favors something small and evanescent. So it's good that Jacob got the birthright. End of story. Okay? Is that true? How did Jacob get the birthright? Through devious means. So, don't you love, at least I do, that the author is not a simpleton? Jacob deserves the birthright. Let's give it to him. And it came to pass that though Jacob was the younger son, the family agreed that he should have the birthright, and they gave Esau other things to mollify him. End of story. The right guy has the birthright. That would be, in the hands of a less skilled author, that would be a way to go. I know what I want. I want Jacob to be the guy. He just happens to be the second born, so it's not easy. So I'm going to do a little authorial sleight of hand. I'm going to give it to him. That's not what the author does. The author makes Jacob take it. and take advantage, steal the birthright from Esau. So what's to be made of this? I mean, this is another sibling rivalry story, isn't it? Between two brothers of different sensibilities. Gary?
Yes, they are two individuals, different sensibilities, different walks of life. But I'm not sure I buy the idea that Jacob stole the birthright.
Okay.
He did a deal. It was a deal. You know, Esau came in famished, thought he was at the end of his life. I'm not sure why he thought that, but apparently that's what he thought. Hunger was driving him. He did a deal.
Okay. Right. Yes. So the parents die. This is just another scenario. And the brothers are now sitting around the dining room table after the funeral, in the absence of a will, deciding distribution. And one brother says, now we have to decide between Dad's Mercedes and that beautiful picture on the wall. Is it a Rembrandt? No, it's just some modern guy. And one brother says, I'll take the... Now, how should this work? I mean, the clever brother can, I want to say, dupe the other brother into accepting what is less valuable. And the other brother, the dupee, says, okay. And the brother has tapped into a weakness on the part of his brother, who really loves bright colors. And this picture has a lot of bright colors. Look at the bright colors there. Yeah, I'll take that picture. Now, you're the firstborn. You have a right to the Mercedes, but the picture is yours. Okay, you can have the Mercedes. So it's true that they both agree, but wouldn't you say that there's a manipulation here on the part of the second-born who is taking advantage of a weakness of his brother? So yeah, it's an agreement, but it's an agreement through manipulation, through the cleverness of Jacob to discern what it is, who Esau is. And he's got it. Esau is a belly guy. He wants a full belly. Yeah. Cindy?
Also, the difference between the Mercedes in the picture and the mess of pottage is that a real brother would say, okay, here's some food, let's share it. There was the possibility of sharing that never came up.
Yeah.
You had to sell the whole birthright to get.
You want some soup? I'm a little hungry too. Let's forget the birthright business. Let's just sit down and have some soup. So let's suppose they did that.
Then the end of story.
I'm sorry?
Then the end of story.
Well, it's not exactly the end of the story, because Esau still has the birthright. He's still the guy in charge of the family's lore and destiny. And would this be a good thing for the family? Because the family is going to face big challenges, and they're going to have to decide what the fundamental values of the family are in order for the family to survive as the family in covenant with God. Would Esau be a good custodian of that destiny? I mean, I think this is part of what the Torah is talking about here. In whom does the destiny of the family best reside? Jacob wants it. Jacob's clever enough to be able to deal with some of the challenges that face the family down through time. I mean, don't you think the Torah is suggesting here I don't know if I even like this formulation, that there's something primary about survival, and that a moral code sometimes needs to be put aside in order to do it. Could that possibly be the Bible's message? Lynn?
Like, we have not talked that Isaac chose Esau to be the,
Favored one.
right, well, I don't know the favorite one, but, and because of, again, pace of game. So is Isaac more like Esau? I don't remember that much about Isaac, I'm sorry. But we're talking about, in all through this, we're talking about two different human beings.
Right.
Wherever we've talked about, one is a thinker and
Yeah.
sees the big picture, and one of them has immediacy of needs, like Esau did. He's hungry, let's be.
Immediacy, I like that word, yeah.
And the other thing is too, when we were talking about the shepherd of Cain and Abel,
Yes.
that Cain was the shepherd and Abel was the farmer.
Yes.
Okay, so Cain is, Jacob is compared to somebody who is gentle and he tends to the, doesn't he tend to the flock, Jacob? So he is soft and a thinker and calm, but then when we talked about Abel being a shepherd and gave up the offering of an animal, he's the one that's kind and soft of a person. And he does the lamb.
I'm not sure your point. Are you comparing?
Diameter. Just the first thought, as we haven't thought about Isaac
Yeah.
saying that Esau gets the birthright, and how we talked about the Mercedes and the painting. We have the thinker and the person who thinks of life in a bigger picture, broader strokes, and then the person who thinks of somebody who wants immediate satisfaction. And the same thing with Esau, who likes to eat. That's very important to him. He's going to die if he doesn't. And Jacob, who can stay for hours making a stew.
Yeah, good. So I like your distinction between the need for immediate satisfaction and one who might have more patience. I also like your point about Isaac, because Isaac favors Esau. And you remember later in the story that Isaac is looking for game. He wants a meal. And so the one who can bring him that meal is going to be the one who is favored. And it's going to be Esau. Esau has got to be the one because Esau is the hunter. Well, that's a problem for Rebekah and Jacob, because if in order to get the birthright or the blessing at this point from the father, you have to be Esau, because only Esau can give the father what the father wants. And Rebekah and Jacob have a bright idea. Let's dress you up as Esau. So there's the trickery again on the part not only of Jacob, but the mother. So the parents, Jacob is Rebekah's son. True? In the sense of a fundamental attribute, the ability, the willingness to play a trick in order to get what they want, or to put it more harshly, to do something immoral in order to get what they want, that the end justifies the means in this regard. And there's some power to that here, because if Esau is the guy who carries the covenant, it's going to be in bad hands. And Isaac is also a person who, Isaac says, remember, I'm on my deathbed. But it turns out that Isaac lives another 30, 40 years. So Isaac is, as Esau, exaggerating the problem. I'm at the point of death. Isn't that what Esau says? Yeah, I'm at the point of death. You missed a meal. So here the parents again have a role in this problem, because each parent favors one of the children. Ellen?
It just seems to me the one who's closer to the staying home is capable of building a community.
Wow.
Whereas the hunter is off hunting, which is a necessary thing, but not for building a community.
It's interesting. So you're saying Jacob is a homebody. Do we learn that actually? Do we?
A mild man who stayed in camp.
Okay, very good, very good. What verse is that? Oh, yes. My old man who stayed in the camp. Okay, that's a homebody. And who's the other homebody?
No homebody. Esau is out.
Esau's out. Bill, were you making a parallel to another pair?
I'm saying that you need the one at home to build a community. Although food is necessary, if that person is not capable of building a community.
Right. Good. Well, so if we had time, which we don't, we would look at, this story unfolds in a very, very complicated way, doesn't it? Jacob has to hightail it out of there. Esau's upset with him. Jacob and Rebekah think that Esau's planning to murder Jacob, and Jacob's away for 20 years and gains a lot of wealth, and then he comes back down. God calls him and says, you got to return home here. Here's where God enters the scene and moves the narrative forward. And there is a kind of reconciliation between Jacob and Esau. Let's look at that real quickly here. Chapter 30, where is this? 32, 33, Genesis 33, at the very beginning. So, looking up, Jacob saw Esau coming. Jacob's on his way home. Esau must be learning about this and coming to meet him, accompanied by 400 men. He divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maids, putting the maids and their children first, Leah and her children next, Rachel and Joseph last. Okay, there it is again. He himself went on ahead and bowed low to the ground several times until he was near his brother. Okay, so notice Jacob's stance here, how Jacob behaves. He's bowing low as he walks toward him, okay? Which could be understood as a gesture of repentance. It's not crystal clear, but there seems to be some special deference that is being shown to Esau. Now, look, just to be fair about it, it could be terror, and he's trying to pacify him, and it's not deference at all. Esau ran to greet him. He embraced him, and falling on his neck, he kissed him, and they wept. Now, those of you who have a Hebrew text, notice that there are dots over every one of the letters of the word, and he kissed him. That's one word in Hebrew, and he kissed them. Those dots also appear in the Torah scroll themselves. There are something like 18 places in the Torah where you have these dots. We don't know what it means, but it certainly means that at some point somebody said, this word is noteworthy. Otherwise, why would they put dots over it? Unless the scribe woke up in the morning and he knew he had to distribute 7 dots somewhere, and he does it. So what the rabbis do with this is a variety of things. It points out the quality of Esau's action here, and he kissed him. And there are two opposite opinions about this. It alerts us to the fact that Esau didn't mean this, that he was just trying to pacify or mollify his brother. It was insincere. The opposite view is this is a sign that it is sincere. There's another very interesting interpretation, because the word to kiss comes from the root nun shin kuf, nashak, whereas the word to bite comes from the root nun shin kaf. So neshech means usury. It's a way of taking a bite out of someone's income. Okay? So, because they're so close, neshek and neshech, one interpreter says, no, he didn't kiss him, he bit him. And that's why they wept. And they wept, because it hurt. So this is a rabbinic attempt to undermine Esau's sincerity. By the way, another famous commentator, Ibn Ezra, says that is really a very malicious interpretation. That can't be right. Esau looks genuine here. He's trying for some reconciliation. So if you accept some plausibility to my reading of verse 3, bowing low to the ground, which is a gesture of reconciliation on Jacob's part, I know that's a bit of a stretch, but if you accept that, and you accept Esau's gesture of embracing him and kissing him, the brothers solve their own problem together. Where the parents are only stirring the pot with their preferences, the brothers, now it's 20 years later, have in a way found a way. And what is that way? Let me put it overly simply. The sinner says by gesture, I've sinned. And the sinned against says, I accept that. Let's be friends again. That's a big interpretation of a few little words here. But what is interesting is, once again, not only do the brothers, through their own attributes, get themselves in trouble, but they also have the attributes to solve the trouble they've gotten themselves in. Doris?
In chapter 32, though,
Yes?
verse 4, Jacob actually does
Yes.
say that he wants to be reconciled.
Yes.
So the point that you turned us to in chapter 33 was already on Jacob's mind. A reconciliation was on his mind in 32. He's been working at it for a while.
Yeah.
So, verse 4 and following, he says, here, send a message ahead to my lord Esau, that I hope by giving you a gift coming forth, I can gain your favor, and that we will be reconciled.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's a wonderful comment. So you're saying several things here. One of them is, in what I said was a somewhat fragile interpretation of verse 3 of 33, bowing low to the ground, is now strengthened by Jacob's already having thought about it. And you're also pointing out that Jacob is involved in a process. This is not just, at the spur of the moment he says, let me try to be a good guy for whatever reason. Maybe he's terrified, so let me bow low. No, this is a sign of his own genuineness. So I like that interpretation very, very much.
And you mentioned that he might have been frightened that Esau rejected him, and it actually says that. Jacob was greatly frightened.
Right, but
Verse 8.
yes, but notice that being frightened comes after the gesture to which you point. So if it had been reversed, I'm frightened, and then let me divide the children and so on, that would have been very, very different. Yeah. Scott?
Well, yeah, we also know, though, that Jacob is a shrewd negotiator, and he may have feigned this subservience. Maybe that's the bite that they're talking about. Maybe it's a sarcastic subservience. Maybe he realizes, hey, I know how to best this guy. I give him instant gratification, and I get what I want.
That's a very good
And
point.
right now, my need is survival. I need these two cans to survive.
So we know something about Jacob as an instrumentalist. What is it I need, and what are the vehicles to get there? And so let's not overstate his repentance. By the way, when we get to the Joseph story, Joseph and his brothers, the brothers solve their problem without the intercession of the father. As if to suggest, just to extend your point, that they recognize that somehow Jacob cannot be a real constructive force in this, being who we know our father to be. We'll do it ourselves. So there's another parallelism here. The two brothers, Jacob and Esau, solve their problem together without the father, as Joseph and his brothers do without the father. Although what is also interesting is Judah's great plea to Joseph is centered on our common father and what this will mean to him if Benjamin isn't sent back. So that the father is venerated, but the possibility of the father's playing a productive role in the reconciliation is, now I'm going to overstate it, pushed aside. What's the way we say this? Silence. You can't argue too big a conclusion on the basis of what isn't there. Yeah. Jackie?
But don't you, when you have children who are fighting and you have interventions by parents, what happens?
Say that again, you what?
If you have children who are fighting
Yes.
and the parents start to intervene, what happens? Not very much, but you have the parents back away and the children will find a way to make peace. Same thing here.
Yeah. You wonder if, there are two ways of looking at this. The absence of the parent can facilitate the brothers doing it. But the absence of the parents may not be as a result of a conscious choice on their part to stay out of it, just could be that they're out of it.
That's right.
You're adding that the wise parent might act in that way, but do we have any evidence that Isaac is wise in this respect?
There's no concrete evidence.
No concrete evidence. Well, I think we need to stop. No Torah study next week, and we always take a couple of weeks off at the end of the month. So our next Torah study will be the first Saturday in January. We'll be way ahead. All right. Somebody said the other day when I said that, so what? So, Shabbat Shalom.
Say, 20 years makes a difference too. We haven't seen each other. Pretty much what you're saying about the parents. But I was thinking right away, well, it's been 20 years. Things change. Besides aging and being more mature experience, it distances the hurt, right? Okay.
So you're pointing to yet another factor in
why Jacob did what he did, and I agree with you. One word comes first in the Bible, and the word is that he has wanted to reconcile, but he is fearful. He always wanted to reconcile, he's fearful. And at this moment, the same thing. He's, bending down. This is first inclination was that he hopes they can reconcile, but he also is fearful. So this kind of hits close to home with other people when they are deceived and they are, there's a difference in the relationship. And it's too bad that they can't reconcile because there wasn't enough years left. And one day I'll tell you the story of my mother-in-law, and it's a sad thing what happened. Well, right. We were very close until she moved here when she was 84, and then she became very close to Dennis Kinnick, and the dynamics of what happened. And then so my mother-in-law died 20 years later, and I didn't have a love to her, and that's too bad because who's going to be the one to carry on remembering her and all that? It's me, of course, and my husband and my children, but it's pretty much me. And that does a disservice to her because I lost that real connection that we had for 40 years due to a relationship that, but that's for another time. That's things to talk about. Oh, my question? Oh, well now, which one?
Well, you was raised to ask me or make a comment.
Oh, just about those 20 years.
Yeah,
We're ignoring there's 20 years since they've seen each other, and rather than getting into all the nitty-gritty of what 20 years does, it does this stuff. This happens to people. It should. It should.
That's what is so amazing.
Even in the conversation, they meant and they
So the gods point to lots of other things that may happen.
I think it's... And I don't think that they would have run to each other and bit each other. That's like you said, that's gruesome, or whatever word you use to describe it. It's not a good thing to think about.
What's that?
What was happening was that Esau bit. Was biting, and that's why Jacob. Cried. Right, but I'm getting my people mixed up because we've talked about so many of them in this discussion.
Esau is one of the rabbis, the ancestor of the Roman Empire. Another reason to read that enmity.
Right. That's right. Right. He has a value. He has something important.
Esau can't be a real good guy because look what Cain did.
Yeah. Thank you. You'll always enjoy.
Oh, good. Glad to have you.
Asked the Lord for instructions, and he said, the younger shall serve the older shall serve the younger.
Yes. And therefore, God is the troublemaker.
Yeah. Well, God is the troublemaker, along with human beings.
You and my Catholic that God plays a part in that story. That God is not the gracious, sympathetic.
I think God is a combination of the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Norse gods. Well, Greek gods at least were involved in human affairs. They had favorites. Athena diverted the arrows and plotted for the Greeks to win. Yeah. Too many. Okay.
Have a wonderful trip.
And you too?
Have a wonderful trip. Sounds great.
So many questions. The integrity of, I love it when you just speak and, mostly because you put things together so that you can have a concrete understanding of what you're saying. Because usually in the class, message was given. The message was given. I can't hear. So when there's so many people adding in, it makes me kind of like confused. I'm not able to hear, so I lose the or at least so you can repeat the question. But if you have 15 of them, you can't repeat 15 questions. It eats into your
Thank you. I won't ask about that anymore.
Love the conversation. I know you're not saying all.
No, I'm not saying all.
Some people have not come
So I find both segments.
Because I lose the translation and not get showing Scott because of my age and my ability to connect the dots. But part of it is weird to connect the dots. But you gave something about I was talking to Terry how I didn't understand why we were doing this. I didn't understand anything about it. Next time, which was going to be a month ago, you just gave a lecture for your members, just you. And I thought to myself, this is so just joking. And you just delivered
Well, for about a year during the COVID crisis.
Oh, during the COVID crisis, sure. I was in it by myself.
This was just recently, and I said, I couldn't. And then the following week, or it was a couple days later, you did the whole thing by yourself. I'll have to file it.
Well, but I appreciate your comments.
You're good. I got time. You're good.
Unless it's a concise, 3-sentence question or comment, and the person's voice is loud enough. That's not
difficult though. In the case I remember last week, or 2 weeks ago, when James brought up all the instructions and minutia and the Tower of Babel, that would be hard to paraphrase.
Oh, that was so. No, I can't. I said, because before he said that, everything that Rabbi was saying, he kept going, He kept relating to it by his, like this was validating. Oh, yeah, no, I said, so I teased him, I said, this was right in your alley, and jumped on it. So I've been taking fun of this time. I said,
Do you want to jump in?
I just want to say thank you for helping out with my essay.
I'm so glad you came.
Yeah.
So you are finishing this spring?
Yes.
And then are you going on?
I am not applying for grad school for probably another year.
Okay. What are you going to do?
I'm going to work for a bit. I'm not sure where yet. Still working on it.
Are you going to try to do it here in Cleveland?
I'm not sure. It's going to be wherever I get.
Okay. So you're open to going to Denver if need be?
Yeah.
Well,
I spent my summer in Nashville, so.
if you're around, I hope you'll drop in from time to time.
Alrighty, yes.
Great to see you.
This is fun.
Say hi to everybody.
Alrighty, will do.
Good.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
So I did do some research on stuff. I did find an interesting thing, coincidence, obviously. 15 years later, significant bombing. Yeah, so it's a pretty mighty fist, a gigantic fist. But anyway, this is Steve, you know that piece. I think you'd be fascinated.
Yes, I do.
Oh, do you? Okay.
But, great, can I have this?
Yeah, that's what it's for.
Oh, is it?
Now, I apologize for two things. Number one, for some reason, when I downloaded it, it started duplicating. This, and for the next 5 minutes, is duplication.
Oh, I see.
I believe this is complete.
How nice.
This is so difficult to read, but it's very important.
Oh, good, okay.
So I found it easier to read if I did this. I blocked out one line at a time, but it's difficult.
I know that
This is
story.
so dense.
And it says here that there are four.
Yeah, the four stages of the, yeah.
Right.
This
Yeah,
is-
that's
this
the
is
story
amazing.
where Kafka says, and we keep building the building. It's not finished, but down through the ages we continue.
Yeah, right. Right. I saw a quote somewhere that said it was from ethics, but I don't know if it was Aristotle's ethics or not. But it said something about we're not obligated to complete the task, but that does not free us from engaging in the.
That's a famous rabbinic statement.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's,
it could be another
so it's a
culture.
midrash ethics thing that is.
Right. It's from the ethics of the fathers.
Okay. I didn't know it just said ethics. It was
Oh, did it?
It
Okay.
just said ethics. So I didn't know, yeah, I mean, there's other people have written ethics too. I mean, Aristotle one, but there's been other guys too. Spinoza, I think, right?
It's all, yes, no, that's true. That's one of the world's toughest books. He writes it as geometrical. Axioms, propositions, lemmas, corollaries.
This could have been, there's this part in here, a paragraph, that could have been a preface to Jonathan Sacks on God's name. He talks about Babel being an effort in God's name that was vain, you know.
Let us make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
I'm going to be talking about Kafka next month.
All right, this might throw some
Oh,
fuel into it.
well, I've spent a little time with this legend, short stories, but.
Well, it's not, he's not restricted to that.
Oh, good.
There's like 4 concepts in here, at least, 4 steps.
This is amazing. I've been reading a lot of Kafka recently. He's good.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for introducing me to it.
Oh, good.
Okay, take
All right,
care.
talk
Thank
to you
you very
soon.
much.
When's your surgery?
Not till January, so it'll be later that month.
Okay. Well, will you
We're looking at Yeah, I will let you know.
Oh, definitely. You're going to be obviously rehabbing.
Yeah. My son is committed to take care of me for a few weeks.
Isn't that good?
Yeah. Yeah, 'cause I tried to be left-handed for the past couple of weeks, and it's going to be difficult.
Oh, I know. I've tried it myself from time to time. It's amazing that we're so coordinated with our right hand and so nothing with our left. I mean, these guys who are switch hitters.
Is there a picture out there now?
There was a guy, there were a couple of guys who were at the Temple-Tifereth. I can't remember their name.
And there's rules. I don't think there are.
Oh, is that true?
What an ideal situation that would be, a lady and a lefty.
Jim Abbott lost.
Oh, well, that might be, but that might be also
Right? Reading about a guy that would put it under his arm and throw.
Right, no, I think he was a lefty.
next fall's luncheon instead
And I
of
think that.
But yes, we should
He
make that
had
a
a rub in
priority.
his right, under his right eye, or his stuff on his
Look into that
After he
and
threw,
let them
he quickly got the glove on so he could be a fielder.
to find, because you never know when somebody else is gonna come in.
Yeah.
Because they're only.
Rabbi, you know, I'm a
You too,
monist.
Scott.
I have to admit now, I'm realizing I'm a monist.
Hey, how are you?
And that's probably not good, but if you look at it, these two references, you know, what do I need? Esau saying, what do I need contracts and guarantees for? I just need some food and appears I need vegetarian food too, lentils, not just my sheep. Okay, but then later, when they approach each other before, there's an exchange where Jacob and Esau say, I think Esau says, I have everything I need. Right? And then Jacob says, I have everything. I may
may have them.
I think they both said, Esau certainly says
One says,
that.
I have everything I need, and the other one says, I have everything according to.
Oh, good,
And I
good.
wasn't able to find a time to go this way, but I think the point is that has an implicit theory of meaning there. Right? They're using this word, and I was looking for the Hebrew word in here because of all this.
Yes, yes, yes.
And, but I think the issue is that the question is, what do we really need? And it's not just material.